to begin with, how would you define climate-induced migration?
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting question, and there are a lot of people obviously studying climate-induced migration. And it doesn't, I mean, that's a good question as to whether or not there's any kind of accepted definition being used in the international community at the moment. My gut feeling is no, but I'm not following climate-induced migration discussions on a day-to-day basis. So, but my feeling about whether or not there's a kind of an agreed upon definition is that there is not. If you wanted to ask me how I would define it, I mean, one of the issues about climate-induced migration is, first of all, if you think about it from the context of what we are developing in the international framework in terms of policy, usually there has to be some connection somewhere where the people who are migrating are somehow distinguishable from the general population. So whether they belong to a particular marginalized group, or if it's because of poverty, or sometimes it can be racial, ethnic, religious. Those are the kinds of things that are connected with a more traditional view of kinds of groups that are forced to migrate. And it's also very hard to distinguish between climate-induced migration and normal economic migration, unless you can show that there is a connection to membership in a specific group.
So going off of that, as climate change worsens, do you think it will be easier to identify climate-induced migration?
What was this? To identify what?
To identify climate-induced migration versus just the other forms of migration that you were discussing?
No, because then you still have the problem of the causation, because you're going to have people in most cases, if you establish a framework for climate-induced migration, specifically as a kind of a remedy. So first of all, okay, what the international community is working on quite a lot is the issue of resiliency under the Sendai Framework. So things like preparedness and immediate response. But once you would develop a kind of a more elaborate framework where you would have certain protections and certain rights, then there will be much more, it will be much more highly contested as to whether or not something falls within that framework of climate-induced migration or not. So indeed, you will have a lot of, at the moment, we don't have so much of that, but going forward, if the international policy response becomes stronger, you will have much more kind of, policy fights about how to define and how to allocate the resources towards certain groups and not others.
So I'm glad you mentioned the Sendai Framework. I have a few questions about that. So would you mind explaining just superficially what exactly the Sendai Framework is and how it does pertain to climate-induced migration?
So, I mean, the Sendai Framework is one of the four main international policy instruments which came out of the 2015 international conferences that established the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The others being the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and the Addis Ababa Action Plan, which is about financing. And the Sendai Framework is maybe the least well-known of these, maybe the least, attractive in the sense that at least Addis Ababa is about financing, so it's about money. But in terms of international policy development and in terms of transforming societies, the Sendai Framework is really important, because what the Sendai Framework is looking at, because it's about disaster risk reduction, is it's looking at specifically the causes of risk and the factors that can be used to reduce risk and to manage risk. So the Sendai Framework comes into climate-induced migration from the point of view of the fact that societies, in order to be resilient, they have to be able to respond to pressures that come from different directions, including not just sort of traditional, our traditional understanding of natural disasters, but it can also relate under the Sendai Framework to situations which have a human cause or which are exacerbated because of human activity or because of, in some cases, mistakes that have been made in the past in terms of developing things like cities or, just in coming up with various policies. So, so the Sendai Framework is looking at it from a preventative point of view, or at least a preparedness, let's say, preparedness point of view is maybe a more accurate term.
And then, sorry, so with the Sendai Framework looking at climate-induced migration, perhaps from a more preparedness point of view, from your knowledge on the international scale, are there perhaps any other frameworks or policies, et cetera, that are addressing climate-induced migration?
It's a good question. I think so. There are a lot of issues that are tied up together. So, for example, when you asked me this question, I started to think of some of my colleagues that are working in related fields, and one of them deals a lot with conflict, and he deals with environment and conflict. And so he would look at climate as a factor leading to conflict in some cases. So you'd have some climate-induced conflict that could obviously lead to migration, because in situations of conflict, you have very often a lot of migration. In fact, right now, that's probably the major cause of migration in the world at the moment. So probably got off the track a little bit here, but maybe you can get me back on track again.
Yeah. I guess it's just saying that, like, when it comes to climate-induced migration, it seems that a lot of the policies that we're currently working with, or that are currently being worked with, are quite indirect, and there don't seem to be many, at least from what I can gather, that are directly addressing climate-induced migration. So whether it be about resiliency or coming at it from a conflict perspective.
Right. And one of the major reasons for that is because climate-induced migration, in many, many, many instances, I think the majority, I don't know if the vast majority, but certainly the most, if you want to look at it, of course, we haven't even defined it from the beginning, but let's just say we are talking about something called climate-induced migration. A lot of times that would involve internally displaced people. So you would have people moving from one part within the same nation state, from one place to another. And, maybe they would be moving into the cities, and maybe that would be creating social unrest. Or maybe they would move, to, further into the margins, to a more, more marginal part of the country. So that limits the ability of the international community to develop policy responses where the impacts are very often within a specific country. So right now, you have the situation, you have these flooding situations in different countries. Bangladesh was recently, I think you're seeing flooding now in some other countries. Even in Europe, you're seeing flooding in some areas. And, most of the impacts of that are going to be felt within the specific country. And a lot of countries do have the ability to respond to that. And then some don't. I mean, some get really pushed to the brink, and then they're going to be asking for international assistance. But that's one of the difficulties in coming up with international policy responses when you're talking about climate-induced migration.
So, I mean, with these difficulties in mind, the Sendai Framework is hitting its midterm review this year. COP27 is in November. What do you think needs to happen in order to address climate-induced migration, if even?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the world is taking a multi-pronged approach to many related issues. If you want to eliminate the cause, then you do, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If you want to try to address some of the impacts, then you do adaptation and mitigation. That costs a lot of money. So I think you are seeing a gradual change in attitude around the world, maybe even more than, more quick than gradual. Change in attitude around the world to awareness about what the people's impacts are towards greenhouse gas emissions. And you are seeing, I think, a lot of improvement in carbon intensity of most people's lives, in most people's lives. So that's certainly something good. But I think you have, the main problem is you still have a lot of investment in fossil fuels and other kind, not just fossil fuels, big agriculture, other kinds of parts of our lifestyle which are ingrained and which are very hard to change. So and you have a lot of people who don't, let's say, who cannot simply change tomorrow from that kind of activity. And then of course they will fight against efforts to to reduce their power, influence, and their wealth. So that's not an easy question, how to deal with that. But I think, if you think, for example, you see what's happened in the Middle East, there were a number of petroleum exporting countries which began to look, when the price of oil started to go down, they began to look as if they were trying to diversify their economies and using that wealth to invest in their societies and make them to be, in fact, more resilient. Then with the pandemic and the crash, and then the kind of the rebound and the shortages and people making money left and right, particularly in the fossil fuel industry, then that kind of disappeared. I think that's only a temporary thing, but you just see, the markets are going to be doing this all the time. There's not a whole lot you can do. But the one kind of market-based behavior where I do see people making a change around the world is just the sense that they have a greater awareness of problems regarding certain greenhouse gases, and they are changing their personal behavior. That gives me some encouragement.
Well, those are all the questions I had for you.
Okay.
So, thank you so much for taking the time to answer the couple questions I had.